everyone for coming to the CHEP seminar this week. We have Jeff Weaver joining us from the University of Southern California. Jeff received his PhD in economics from Yale University in 2017, and then he did a postdoc at UCSD in 2017-2018. He's a labor and development economist who's also done some work on crime. And today he's going to be presenting some of his new work on marriage markets and the rise of dowry. Thanks so much for being here.
No, thank you very much for having me here. It's been great being here, and thanks to everyone I met with during the day. It was really fun hearing about your research and getting comments on stuff I was working on. So it's been a really nice day. And it's also nice to be back in San Diego, which, you know, LA is great, but I have to say San Diego is, I think, a little bit nicer. So as everyone in San Diego always loves to tell me when I live in LA. So the project I'll be talking about today is on marriage markets and the rise of dowry in India. And so this is joint work with Gaurav Chaplankar, who's at UVA Darden. And so we were grad school classmates back. As you said, it's been a couple of years now. I'm starting to realize this is a paper that we've been working on during grad school. Never really were able to finish up. In the last 6 months or so, we've had a major push in putting some new analysis into the paper. And so really, this is the first time we're presenting really most of this paper. So we're excited to get feedback and to hear your thoughts. And so, in general, the motivation for this paper is, so marriage markets have been a topic of interest to economists since probably Becker in 1973 and potentially before that, but this is really the paper that, you know, made economists start to get more interested in marriage markets. And so we're going to be looking at this, we're going to be very focused on one particular aspect of marriage markets, and these are going to be payments that are made at the time of marriage. And so this could either be bride price, and so these are payments made from the household of the groom to that of the bride, or dowry or groom price, which is what we'll be focused on in this paper. So payments that are made from the household of the bride to the household of the groom. And so most societies at some point in their evolution, most developed country societies at some point in their evolution, have had payments at the time of marriage. So for dowry, for example, which is the focus of this paper, we see this historically in ancient Greece and the Roman Empire. So if you go back to 800 BCE, that's the first record that I know that we have of dowry payments being made. This is something that's been pretty common since then. So you observe it in medieval Europe, Western Europe, you see this in colonial Brazil and other places in colonial Latin America. It's something that's been observed in many, many societies. The place where we mostly see it today is in contemporary South Asia. So if you look at Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, we see that dowry payments are made in over 80% of marriages. And so one of the motivations for this paper is understanding why does this happen, how does this institution emerge, and then potentially what are some of its consequences. And so one of the reasons that we might think this is important as economists is just the size of these transfers are enormous. And so we see that on average in our data set, the size of a dowry transfer that's made, again from the household of the bride to the household of the groom, averages over a year's worth of earnings. And so this is an absolutely enormous economic transaction, which you might think has consequences for many other economic outcomes that we're interested in. When we take in our data, we look to see what is the average size of dowry payments made in each year between 1950 and 1999. And we multiply that by the number of marriages that we can estimate pretty well using census data. We see that the total value of dowry transfers between 1950 and 1999 was about 250 billion current US dollars. And so this is an enormous sum of money, particularly in an economy like India, where the GDP overall in 1970 was about 100 billion US dollars. In 1999, it was about 500 billion US dollars. And so this is a huge amount of money, potentially quite important for the economy as a whole. And so dowry typically, and so to go through some of the research that people have done in South Asia in particular, is dowry is typically viewed as quite harmful. So there's some great research looking at how dowry affects sex-selective behavior, where you might imagine if you know that if you have a female child, you're going to have to make a very large transfer at the time of marriage. This incentivizes households to increase rates of sex selection, eventually neglect of female children. Other research showing this has implications for violence against women. And so Prashant and I were talking about this a little bit before. But there's, unfortunately, the cases of dowry murders and dowry violence where households will threaten women who after the point of marriage, violence or potentially even with death in order to encourage larger dowry payments being made after the time of marriage. And so these papers here show this is potentially quite important. A very nice recent paper looking at how this affects investment behavior. So in this case, they're interested in how does dowry affect investment in female children versus male children. And in general, there's a great deal of public interest in elimination of dowry. And so what we're interested in saying is, so the paper that we wanted to write on this was actually the paper that I just cited, the Anukrethi et al. 2019. This is the paper we initially set out to write. They had already written this paper by the time we were about halfway through analyzing the data, and so we said, let's write another paper because we found all these patterns in the data that we didn't know how to explain, and then we realized there's actually potentially even more interesting things here that we had not realized at the start. So word to the grad students in the audience, even if you find out that you get scooped, there may still be something that you can do with the project. And so in terms of where we stand in terms of the literature on dowry, so there's a lot of great theoretical models out there in trying to explain why does dowry exist, why we may see dowry increase in a society, or why we may see dowry disappear in a society. But there's been very limited in the way of empirical work. And so Simon Anderson in 2007 wrote a review paper in the Journal of Economic Perspectives reviewing the literature on bride price and groom price. And what she says is that there's a lot of good theoretical models out there, many of which she has written, but there's not been very much in the way of empirical work and testing of these models to see which of these models can actually explain what's going on here. Where if you have 5 different models of the same phenomenon, maybe this is a multi-causal situation, maybe all of these are correct, but it might also be the case that some of these are not correct. And so that's what we're going to be doing today. We're going to be using data on dowry in order to try to test some of these theoretical models. And so the research questions we're going to be focused on in this paper are first, why and how does dowry emerge in a society? And so we're going to be focused on the case of India because that's the context in which we have data from. But this emergence of dowry is something we see in many different locations. So there's another really nice paper looking at the emergence of dowry in Bangladesh over a similar period, looking for different mechanisms there. So there they point to emergence of a legal institution. So some of you may have seen this paper, Ambrose et al. 2010 in the QJE. The mechanism that they're looking at there, in case you have this in the back of your mind, is something very different from what we're going to be looking at, since what's happening in that context doesn't happen at all in India. And so we're going to be looking at 5 different mechanisms to try to understand why and how does dowry emerge in a society. While doing this, we're going to document some new facts on the prevalence of dowry. So how has the prevalence of dowry changed over time? How have the size of dowry payments changed over time? Have these increased? Have these decreased? Where, as you'll see in a bit, a bunch of the existing facts are based on very small samples of data that may not be quite right when talking about a country as large and heterogeneous as India. But really the main focus of the paper, the main meat of the paper, is saying what economic or sociological theories can explain dowry and the evolution of dowry. We're going to be looking at 5 main theories. So today I'll probably get through 3 of these theories. If we have time at the end, I'll go through 4 and 5. We're going to be trying to empirically test, do these theories actually match what we see in the data? What we find is that only one of the theories that we test is consistent with the data that we observe. And when we take this theory to the data to try to say, as a back of the envelope calculation, how much of the changes that we observe in dowry can be explained by this particular mechanism, we see that it can explain about 70% of what we see. So we think this is strong evidence that this is really what's driving a lot of what we observe. I'll talk about that as we get to it. And then finally, in terms of the implications of these results, we think this is important in thinking about how are marriage markets going to continue to evolve over time? Is dowry going to continue to exist? Is it going to disappear, as we've seen in many other contexts? And then what are the best strategies for elimination of dowry? Where in order to understand what is the best way to fight against dowry, if as policymakers we might think that's important, and so many policymakers in India do think that's quite important. Understanding why does this actually exist is important in thinking about what strategies may work and what strategies may not.
So there have been some attempts, I think I remember reading in your paper, right, to eliminate, to ban. So and then they were sort of relatively unsuccessful because of enforcement or.
So that's exactly right. So there's major enforcement concerns with that, and so I'll talk about that in 2 slides. But there's been a number of laws that were passed to try to just ban dowry completely. What we see is partially just due to how the Indian administrative state works. The judiciary system is very, very ineffectual, and so we see that even when people file a case against someone in cases of dowry, these only actually end up in a conviction around 30% of the time. And so just sort of the Indian administrative apparatus, if you look at the judiciary, there's a job market candidate from UC Berkeley this year looking at the judiciary in India, a very understudied subject, and she finds there's just incredible delays in basically any sort of case progression. And so furthermore, even if you file a case against someone, you might be worried. So in many cases in India, you actually don't want to file a case because you're worried this is going to lead to interactions with the police that you'd be better off potentially avoiding. And so just due to sort of the weakness of the Indian state, this is not something that's been very effective so far, even though policymakers have said this is something we want to cut down. And so to give just a bit of a background on marriage markets in India, And so we see, so this is using a nationally representative data, the Indian Human Development Survey. We find that 95% of marriages in India are arranged. This is something that's well known. And about 65% of these marriages, the bride and the groom are only meeting at the time of the wedding. And so the way that you're going to want to think about the marriages being formed is it's really an agreement that's reached between the household of the bride and the household of the groom. In the majority of cases, in some cases they know each other before, and most they don't. In fact, in many of the cases where they know each other beforehand, at least historically, these are actually cases of cousin marriage, where it's people who are related through cousins. And so this is about 10 to 15% of the cases that we see historically. And so really you should think of this as cases in which really the parents are the ones who are deciding who's getting married to whom and deciding these dowry transfers. There's also an institution of patrilocal endogamy. So after marriages, in almost all cases, the wife is going to move to the household of the husband and live with their in-laws there. Where marriages are almost entirely going to be within subcaste or jati. And so what this is based on the historical occupation of the family within the village economy. So there's one for leather workers, another one for water carriers, where if you're from the water carrier jati, then you're only really going to marry someone from exactly that same group. And so we see that 94% of marriages are within people who are from the exact same jati, and this is incredibly stable over the entire century. So if we look at this historically, what we see is that oh no, I lost my button, so I'll have to scroll back very quickly. What we see is this is looking historically at what percentage of marriages are between people from the exact same jati, so the husband and wife are from the same, going back to 1920. And so we're using a couple different data sets here to look at that. And we see it's incredibly stable over time. And through the time period we're going to be looking at, through 1999, there's almost no changes here. And so, in general, this is how you should be thinking about this. These are marriages, contracts that are made between households of bride and groom, their parents, where the marriages are going to be very restricted within caste community. Marriage markets are also very highly localized, and so 78% of marriages occur within the same district. And so this is a geographical unit. You can think of it as being about 30 miles by 30 miles typically, maybe a little bit bigger, a little smaller depending on the state. And so these are relatively small geographical units. However, most of these marriages are not happening within the village, so only about 15% of them are happening between people who live in the same village. In most cases, you're marrying someone from another village that's nearby from the same subcaste group. And again, this is something that's been very, very stable over time. And so coming to dowry, and so this is the main focus of the paper, and so a lot of the theories that we're going to be looking at here are going to be things of which you might imagine that things like, say, sex ratios could affect other economic behaviors. Here we're going to be very focused on dowry and not so much on other aspects of marriage markets, though of course those are important and interesting. That's just not our focus in this paper today. What we see with dowry in India is it's nearly universal in contemporary marriages, where typically the way that this will work is there'll be different components of dowry. So there may be cash transfers. We see this in most of these marriages. Exchange of jewelry, which happens in virtually all marriages, as well as other types of gifts, depending on the wealth of the household. So you might imagine for a wealthier household, perhaps they might include a car in the dowry, so this is a very expensive payment. For a less wealthy household, this might be something like a bicycle, or a little higher end, maybe a scooter or two-wheel vehicle. And so typically what we'll see is that there's gifts and transfers made in both directions. It's not just going from the household of the bride to that of the groom, but there's also gifts that go in the other direction. But when we look at this empirically in the data, and I'll talk about that in 3 slides, is the transfers that are made from the bride to the groom are about 7 times larger than the transfers made from the groom to the bride. And so we're going to be including both of those in the transactions we're talking about. We really should mostly be thinking about this as transfers from the bride's household to that of the groom. And so in terms of the laws, and so this is what Joe was asking me about, and so there's been a number of laws passed to try to prohibit dowry. So the first one was in 1961, so a long time ago. This officially made dowry legal, but there's many, many loopholes in this law, and so in effect it really had almost no teeth to it. In 1985, there was another law passed that added a little bit more teeth to this law, and another one passed in 2005. The period that we're mostly going to be looking over is between around 1940 to 2000. And so for most of these, it's really the Dowry Prohibition Act, which is going to be in effect, which basically everyone has said has had almost no effect on actual dowry payments. And as it says here, answering your question earlier, these laws are incredibly poorly implemented. So in about 34% of cases, even conditional on reporting, there's a conviction. But in the vast majority of cases, there's absolutely no reporting of this, since so I have other projects looking at the Indian police, and in many cases you kind of want to avoid interacting directly with the Indian police because you're worried this is going to cause more problems than it potentially would solve. And so what we're going to be doing in terms of the dowry that we use in this paper, the data on dowry that we'll use in this paper, is probably going to be coming from one source. And so this is the 1999 wave of the Rural Economic Development Survey. So this is collected by NCAER in India in partnership with Andrew Foster at Brown and Mark Rosenzweig at Yale. And so this is a representative sample of households, rural households across 259 villages. And so I want to be very clear, the data we're going to be looking at today is only from rural households, it's not from urban households. There's other data that suggests that many of the patterns that we see here are also going to be found in urban households. This is across 259 villages, across 16 states, and so the states that are covered by this data contain about 96% of the population. And so you should really think of this as saying something about the entirety of India. This is going to be an advantage that we have over some of the existing data that I'll talk about as we get to it. The data that we're going to have is going to be data on about 74,000 marriages between 1900 and 1990. That shouldn't say 95, this should say 1999. It's through 1999. What this is going to be is this is going to be retrospective data where the surveyors interview the head of the household. They ask them about their marriage, the marriages of all their brothers and sisters, the marriages of all their sons and daughters, as well as their parents. And so something that's going to be nice about this data is they're going to also ask about people who have died. And so if you have a brother who is married, who may have passed, they're still going to be asking about that marriage, and so we're less worried about mortality-related attrition than we might be in some other countries.
I just wonder if they collected the data in 1999, how can there be any marriages in 1900?
Yeah, so the 1900 marriage, we're basically going to throw that out. The marriages we're going to look at are really going to be 1930 and afterwards, and so it's going to be a lot of the household heads' parents in those cases. We've done some different robustness checks to see. So what I would say about that is I completely agree. I'll talk about some of the robustness checks that we run in a second. But basically, I think we take the data more seriously starting around 1940 or 1950, and so that's the main focus of our paper. And in all the empirical analysis we're going to do, it's going to be focused on 1951 onwards. Yeah.
I'm not sure you covered the origin of dowry and all of that earlier, but I think for those of you who may not know much about the concept of dowry, I don't know, did you say anything about it earlier?
Yeah, so I talked about it a little bit earlier, and I'm going to talk about it in a bit more detail on some of the theories that are out there. But in general, I was just explaining what dowry is. I'm going to be showing some facts on dowry as well. But in the very
Your
first.
definition given is somewhat different. So let me just give you an idea what a dowry is. I think the concept of dowry is defining is very different from what is supposed to do. Dowry in Tamil, in English, the Indian language is Sridhanam. That means is the money given to the bride, the girl. When she is married, when a person, in the earlier days, the girls did not have an equal right in the property of the family. So at the time of the wedding, then the bride's parents give her certain amount of money. And money in form of jewelry or the cash or whatever, or land or anything, whatever you want to have. This is transferred to her, not to the family as is being defined in here.
So we have direct evidence on that, and in fact, in earlier stages that's true, but if you look in the later stages, that's not so true.
It evolved over a period of time.
Sure, yeah, and that's exactly what we're talking about,
Yeah, and then that money cannot be taken by the bridegroom. That money belongs only to the bride.
So in theory that's true, but in practice, if you actually ask households who has control of the money, they say it's the groom and the groom's family.
No, yeah, let me give you some ideas so that you can have some idea. I'm not questioning your definition, but I'm just trying to give you the history of that so that they will have a better idea of what happened. So when that happens, then if the girl dies, the property goes back to the family from where it came from. Or if it survives and they've got a daughter, when she dies, that property that she brought into the household goes to the daughters, not to the sons. So you can see it is a way of arranging the division of the property at the time of the wedding. That's one thing. As he said, over a period of time it has evolved differently in different parts of India.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Okay. The northern part of India, the data you are maybe getting from, then you have to see why what kind of money they give, how it is determined. That's what I wanted to say. Yeah, I don't want to talk about that. So it all depends upon the various kinds of characteristics he is going to be doing about it. But the purpose of dowry is to really provide independent source of wealth and possibly income from that for the girl who moves on the parents.
Yeah, so why don't I show you the evidence we have on that, because that's directly what we're going to be testing, and we're going to find that that is not the case. And so that's typically what most people's understanding has been. And so we're going to bring data to this question to see, does this actually seem to be how it's working in practice? And we're going to be finding that's not so much the case. So, but I'll talk about that for sure. Yeah.
So how are people who leave India treated, either temporarily for a period or
Yeah.
for good?
So we're not going to be looking at all the people who exit from India. There are some of them in our data set. It's a relatively small sample of the data that we're going to be looking at. And predominantly, so we talked about this a little bit earlier, predominantly coming from a few states. And so, you could throw out those states and our results are going to look exactly the same. And so we're going to mostly be ignoring people who have migrated, but some of those marriages are going to be in there.
And why the small sample size in the early year?
Yeah, so this is, so the reason for this is basically the way you want to think about it is that most of the household heads are going to be people who are getting married, around this time period here in the 1960s and 1970s. Their children, their brothers and sisters are going to be getting married around this time as well. These are going to be their children, and a lot of these are going to be their parents, some of whom are still alive, some of whom are not okay. And so, once you get back to the 1940s, those marriages, there's about half of the people who are still alive, half of the people who are not. Even if we drop the people who are not still alive, whereas you might worry about data quality in those cases, all of the results are going to look basically the same. Yeah, no good question. Yeah.
So this survey had asked people what was paid for dowry.
Yeah.
So the household head probably has a really good idea of what their marriage was.
Yeah.
They probably have a good idea what their kids are.
Yeah.
They don't know what their parents probably. That's a lot more noise and.
Yeah. So if we throw out all the
Yeah.
parent marriages, we can do that. And so most of those are happening in the earlier time period, and so we can throw those out. And for the empirical results, I'll show you where we're testing these theories. It basically doesn't make any difference for the results. But no, that's a fair point. I think it may or may not be an appendix. I don't know if I sent you the version with the long online appendix. Hopefully not for paper waste related reasons.
Feels pretty heavy.
I'm not sure it has all of it. There's an online appendix and then the online appendix. I'm not sure if this has all of those. Okay, and so when thinking about the transfers that are being made, so there's being transfers that are made in both directions. So we're going to be defining dowry as the net value of these transfers. And so just for simplicity of working with the data, we're going to say, what is the value of transfers made from the household of the bride to that of the groom? We're going to subtract out the transfers that are made from the groom to the bride. In practice, this doesn't really matter that much, just because the transfers made from the bride to the groom are just so much bigger than the transfers made from the groom to the bride. And so, in terms of some of the validation, so some of the concerns you might have is maybe that people just don't remember all that well, and so maybe there's some attrition due to that. So there's going to be a few checks that we're going to be able to run in this data. So one of the nice things with the RED survey is it's actually a panel data set. And so the exact same households get interviewed about 10 years later. And so we can look 10 years later to see, do we see similar, looking at the trajectory of how dowry has evolved over time, and we see basically exactly the same patterns. We can also use, there's another data set called the survey Women in Fertility. So this is a survey in which they separately interviewed the bride and the groom and asked them about what were the gifts given in your marriage. And so these interviews are done separately. We can check to see how well do these things match up and see how well does this match rate hold up going back in time, where if people are just completely guessing because they have no idea, the match rate should be about 50%. In the data, it's about 90%. And even going back through the 1970s, which is as far as this data goes back, that match rate is, I think it doesn't dip any lower than 84%. And so in general, we think, this is an incredibly consequential decision in people's lives. If I asked you, how much did you spend on your house if you were currently a homeowner, you'd probably be able to tell me that answer. This is a huge amount of money, and so we think, for those reasons, that's also likely to be true. Similarly, in cases with the brothers and sisters, we can also slice the data in a different way. Like if the household head is still alive, they probably remember. So if the household head's parents are still alive, they're probably going to remember, the brothers and sisters. It's going to look the same when we slice it that way. All the patterns look pretty consistent. Okay, and so there's going to be a bunch of other data sources that we're using. And so the first of these is going to be from the Census of India, and so this is a decadal census. We'll have data at the district level. So going back to 1911, we're mostly going to use the data from 1951 onwards for some reasons I won't get into here. We're also going to be using data from the National Sample Survey, and so this is going to be from 5 rounds, from 1983 to 2005. We're going to be pooling these rounds together, and this is going to give us about 2.5 million observations on people across India. What we're going to be using this for is to try to get a sense of what is the distribution of educational attainment of people who are on the marriage market in a given year. This is not something that the census collects. We would love it if the census had collected this. They don't. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take this pool of data. This data has information for both men and women on their educational attainment. And we're going to be saying, we're going to use this to say, for people who would have been on the marriage market in, say, 1960, what is the distribution of educational attainment? What percentage of people have 10 years of education versus 8 versus 0? We'll also have some other data sets we'll use for marriage market facts, but I'm mostly going to skip over those today, so I just won't even bother talking about them. The National Sample Survey, so this is collected by the government of India, so there's been rounds done on a variety of different topics, and actually, to the grad students in the audience, it is now available online. You used to have to pay for this, now you can actually get it for free. And so if you're interested in working on India and some good data sets, this is a really nice data set that a lot of people are using. Okay. And so what we're going to be doing now, and so this is going to get back to some of your questions earlier, or so some of the comments you made earlier. Because here really what we're going to be trying to look at is 3 main facts on dowry and how dowry may have evolved over time. And so currently the perception, and so this is coming from, for example, the sociologist M.N. Srinivas, is that dowry is something that's been practiced historically by upper castes. And if you look back in sort of the historical literature, more in literature rather than in other things. These are literatures that are primarily focused on the experience of upper caste individuals, and we do see dowry payments going back for a very long period of time. And so there's a perception that dowry may be more prevalent now than it was in the past. But our question is, how much more prevalent is it now? So M.N. Srinivas, who I'm going to refer to a number of times in this presentation, is a really eminent Indian sociologist, did some field work in some villages in present-day Karnataka, looking at the institution of dowry and how it changed over the 10 years or so he was doing this field work. And his theory was saying that one thing that's been happening is upper castes were historically practicing dowry. Lower castes are now starting to practice dowry in order to emulate these high caste norms in order to increase their perceived status in the caste hierarchy. And so this is something I'll talk about a lot more in about 10 slides or 5 slides. This is a theory we're going to be testing. And so the question that we have in mind here is looking at how prevalent is dowry now versus in the past, and how has this evolved over time? And so we can look at this by state. So there's a graph in the paper that looks at this by state as well. But right now I'm just going to talk about overall national impact. And so what we see is that in the 1920s data, or you can look in the 1930s as well if you're worried about the 1920s, is we see dowry being paid in about 40% of marriages. This explodes and increases to about 90% of marriages by 1975. Where what this looks like. And so what this graph is showing is this is in each of a 5-year period in our data set. What percentage of marriages do we observe that dowry is being paid? And so we see, it's hovering around 40% for this time period here. We see a major growth in the prevalence of dowry. So this gets up to about 87, 88% by 1975 or so. And so we can see is that dowry has just gotten much, much more prevalent over time. Now, historically, dowry was traditionally more prevalent in the north of India versus in the south. And so some of this is that southern India is catching up to northern India in terms of the prevalence of dowry. But this is something we see across virtually all of the states that we look at, where it was previously much less common, now is much more common. There's some northern Indian states in which you see it even historically is paid at very, very high rates, such as Himachal Pradesh. But this is something that seems to be happening pretty much everywhere. And so to the best of our knowledge, even though people have said, we think that dowry is getting more prevalent over time, this is really the first quantitative evidence on this happening. Where the way that we're defining dowry occurring is we're defining these are cases in which when we subtract out the net transfer made from the bride minus that from the groom, we're looking at cases where this is greater than a cutoff value, where there's a positive transfer made from the bride to the groom. So I'm not sure it's in the current draft of the paper. We also look at bride price historically, at bride price historically to look see has bride price decreased as groom price has increased. And we do see decreases in bride price over time. This is primarily concentrated in a couple of different states. It really seems to be a story where dowry is taking over. Of course, we can't say anything in the pre-1940s period, or depending on how far back you want to trust our data, we can't say anything prior to that. But given that we see this massive pattern happening after around 1945 or so, we understand why is this happening? Why is this institution becoming so dominant in India? Okay, so the second thing we're going to look at, so this is, you could think of this as the extensive margin of dowry payments. Is dowry paid or is dowry not paid in a marriage? Another thing we might wonder about is the size of dowry payments. Have dowry payments increased in size over time? Have they decreased? Have they stayed the same? And so most existing work suggests that there's really been a continuous dowry inflation over time, where dowry has been going up, up, up. And indeed, if you talk to policymakers in India, or you talk to my co-author Gaurav prior to us actually looking at the data and writing this paper, what he would say is that dowry has just been going up inexorably over time. However, most of the evidence for this is actually based on very small samples of data. And so one data set which, most of the empirical work on dowry in India has been based on this data set is the ICRASAT data. So this is data from a little less than 200 marriages from 2 states or from 6 villages in India over about a 60-year time period. And we might be concerned with such a small sample of marriages from such a very small location, a small set of location, particularly given how heterogeneous India is, just across all of the many different states. We might be worried that maybe this isn't telling us about the whole picture. And so what we're going to be doing with our data is first just understanding how have the size of dowry payments changed over time. And so, this is a base assumption of many economics papers that dowry has just been increasing over time. So both of these papers are trying to explain this idea of why is dowry just continuously increasing over time, including a very recent paper published in the Economic Journal in this year. And so there's a bit of a dispute in the literature over whether or not this is true. There's been some pushback and reanalysis of some of this ICRASAT data saying, maybe we actually don't see dowry inflation here. Maybe it's a little bit more steady than we would have thought. It's 200 observations over 60 years from 6 villages, and so we kind of think that maybe we want a little bit more data to try to get at this question. Yeah?
You're probably going to mention this later, but where the money is coming from? It's coming from the family or the parents?
Yeah, so it's coming from, so we don't observe in the data where is the money coming from. So from parents for sure, potentially borrowing as well is a major thing, and so in popular, cinema as well, this is a common thing talked about, having to borrow to pay the dowry, potentially also getting from family members as well. But you should think about sort of all these sources as potentially playing a role.
So what is the major source you would guess?
If you want to, so I don't want to speak on this because our data doesn't directly speak to this. If you want to look at the Anukriti et al. Paper in 2019, they speak more to this. And so what they're interested in looking at is savings behavior prior to marriage, and they show very substantial savings prior to marriage for households that know they're going to have to pay dowry because they have a female child versus a male child. So that's the, yeah.
Sorry, maybe a little off topic, but who pays for the wedding?
So the bride's family is usually mostly going to pay for the wedding.
Okay,
so we're not going to talk
a double sort of wedding there.
Yeah, that's
Indian weddings are expensive.
They're very expensive, yeah, for sure. My co-author Gaurav just in fact had a wedding in his hometown of Pune. So yeah, he knows how expensive Indian weddings are. But that's not going to be observed at all in our data. So you could think of that as an additional margin in which maybe there's changes happening. That's just not something we're going to be able to talk about. And so what we're going to be, yeah, go ahead.
So what exactly are you going to talk about? Is this just specifically on the rise of dowry in India, period?
Period India, yes. So we're not going to be looking at other countries, yeah.
Okay, and is there something that has happened that has kind of just put this on the map in terms of why there's a rise in dowry?
Yep.
Isn't there always dowry?
So there was dowry historically. So, sure, thank you. Yeah, so there was definitely dowry historically, and so I've been structuring this presentation with the mystery version of the presentations, where you don't tell people at the beginning what exactly you're going to find. I'm going to talk in like 3 slides about what the different theories are that we have that are out there, and then how we're going to think about analyzing those theories. Because really, what we see as the contribution of the paper is 5 theories out there that we want to analyze to say, is this what's going on with dowry? We're going to use our data to try to see which of these theories seem to match the data or don't match the data, and so that's really going to be the core contribution of the paper. But I haven't actually told you what any theories are, exactly as you said. So there's different schools of thought on how you should present. I'm trying out the mystery version. Well, maybe in future presentations I won't do the mystery box version of this. Okay, and so we're going to be looking at here, here we're going to be plotting what the median dowry is in a particular year. And so this is going to be in 2010 rupees. So you can think of divide this by 50, or 45 more accurately, but you just divide by 50 to try to get this in dollars. And so this is in terms of thousands of rupees. And so in terms of the median dowry payment that gets made, so if you look historically around these periods, about $100, a little more than that, it increases over time. Where we're seeing most of this increase happening is between around 1945 and around 1975. But the dynamics that we see post-1975, it's a little more curious what's going on here. And one reason you might wonder is why is this a little bit more curious? So as we're focusing on the central moment, so you can look at the mean as well, it looks very similar. You might think, what's actually happening in the distribution? Because it may be that there's changes in the upper tail or the lower tail or something like that. And because we have so many marriages, we're going to be able to look at exactly that. And so what I'm going to do now is walk you through what does the distribution of dowry payments look like over time. And I think this is going to be suggestive in thinking about maybe what are some of the theories that might explain what we're actually observing. And so here what we're plotting here is this is the probability density function of dowry payments between 1940 and 1949. And so this is on a log scale because it's impossible to read if we don't put it on a log scale. And so you can see the dowry payment distribution looks something like this, where there's a substantial tail which is not paying dowry at all, and there'd be a spike there if I'd included that, but there's a lot of people not paying dowry. What we see then moving to 1950 to 1959 is we see a shift outwards. Where most of the shift outwards is happening is not in the lower tail of the distribution. It's really happening more in this upper tail of the distribution. And so it seems like something is going on that's causing some of these dowry payments and these dowry payments to really be shifting outwards. And so we're going to explain why is that. Even bigger change that we observe here is between 1960 and 1969, where we start to see some of this movement in the lower tail, but really we start to see a lot of movement up in this upper tail. Right? So we're going to want to think, why is this changing? When we then look at so I'm just resetting it so there's not a million lines on the graph. When we look at this is the 1960s right now. In the 1970s, what we see is, so this is in real terms of dowry payments, so real dowry payments. What we see is that, maybe there's a little something happening right here. But really something kind of striking that's happening is the upper tail of the distribution seems to be shifting inwards somewhat. And we continue to see this pattern happening going into the 1970s, and again into the 1980s, and then again into the 1990s. Where it seems like something is happening in the upper tail of the distribution, not so much in the lower tail of the distribution, and we're going to try to understand why could this be happening, or what could potentially be explaining this. So we'll talk about that at the very end of the paper. This is the most preliminary work, so this is, you are the first audience to see this mechanism, but we think it's somewhat compelling for some what's going on. Yeah.
Can I guess?
Go for it. Yeah.
I think that probably what you have after 1970, you have an enormous increase in higher education of the higher caste women, and then the parents decide, well, we won't pay so much dowry, but you'll become an MD or something.
Yeah. And so we think that, so that's not the mechanism we're going to point to, but we're going to try to hopefully be clear in the paper. We actually think that's part of what's going on, but there's going to be some weaknesses in our data that's not going to allow us to test exactly that. We do think that's a lot of what's going on, but we think there's another mechanism explaining at least part of what's going on, and we can show some evidence of that. Okay, and the next thing we're going to look at is what is dowry as a fraction of income? And so this is taking data from the National Sample Survey going back to 57, which is the first round that we have. And we see is that dowry is increasing as a fraction of annual income over time. So we're dividing by the rural household income over a year. And then it's actually been steadily decreasing as a fraction of overall household income over time. So this is partially due to income growth, particularly in the Green Revolution in the 1960s, 70s. But some of this is the stagnation that we see at the very end, where it doesn't seem like dowry is growing that much, at least in the median, over time. And so now getting to what are we actually doing in this paper? So these are facts that we think are interesting. These are facts that we don't think we really knew before. We had some sense that dowry has been going up, but not really the distribution of the magnitudes. Really what we mostly want to do in this paper is to say, there's a lot of existing and conflicting theories of dowry. Which of these could explain what we see? And so we're going to be generating testable predictions for each one of these theories and trying to say which can best explain these stylized facts. And so the theories that we're going to be testing are going to be the theories on this slide. And so the way I'm going to do this is not explain all 5 theories that I might test, might have time to tell you about one by one. I'm going to go one by one and say, let's start off with standardization, then go to marriage squeeze, then go into earnings and opportunity, and if we have time, caste and modernization and premortem bequests. And so, all of these are theories that have been cited, hundreds of times, if that's your preferred metric for what a prominent theory is. Or if you go with the dominant paradigm in the economics profession, a lot of these have been published in top 5 journals, and so if that's your paradigm for what matters, then you can say you think this matters. We hope. And so there's a few other theories we won't have time to test, but they're in the appendices as well. Okay, and so I want to talk briefly about the premortem bequest, because this is really getting to what you were talking about before. And so one theory of dowry is the reason that people are doing this is it's really a premortem bequest to the daughter. And so the family is giving the daughter what she potentially would get in terms of a bequest. They're giving her this money, and so it's a direct transfer to the daughter. And so this is something that she'll have control over. This is something that gives her some insurance against potential issues she may face in her marriage. So there's a nice theory about it. Yeah.
So does this arise because of the patrilocal norms where
exactly, yeah.
we move to the groom's family, and then if that family
exactly, yeah.
passes away, then
yeah. So exactly. So there's a more complicated theory by Bottacini and Sia, which is a really nice theory, and I think probably explains what's happening in many locations. But the idea here is that if sons stay with the parents and daughters move away from the parents, and sons typically are working on the farm, you're disincentivizing the son's effort in working on the farm because he knows that some of this is going to go to the daughter later on. This idea is you want to give her this bequest earlier on, particularly given she's going to be moving away. And so we have some slides on this that I'm not going to skip ahead to but I want to talk about this because I think we won't have time, and I want to make sure that I'm not completely dismissing anything. And so what it looks like here is, in terms of the premortem bequest explanation, it seems like this isn't something that's going to be able to explain the changes that we observe. And the reason for that is we just see such large increases in the size of dowry payments over this time period, which is prior to the time of India getting wealthier, where we want to think that mostly happening in Green Revolution and afterwards. These changes are so massive, it doesn't seem like it could be something about requests, unless families suddenly decide that they prefer their daughter much more than their sons than they had before, which is not very consistent with other patterns that we observe in investment behavior in the household, such as investment in education in the sons and daughters. And so we're not going to have a direct test for this, but it doesn't seem like something that could explain, dowry is going up by 3 times the magnitude that they report.
But wouldn't it be better to look at dowry as a percentage of income, earnings, because it wasn't such a great increase if you look at it proportionally, and the bequests make sense in terms of what they're also giving the sons.
Yeah, so I want to be clear on this, and so this is a weakness with the data, so I just want to be clear on this. So in the graph where we're looking at as a fraction of income, we're only able to go back to 1957, because that's the earliest point at which we observe nationally representative data on wages. And so if we were to go further back, what this presumably is going to look like, this isn't based on actual data, this is just based on knowing how the Indian economy has grown over time. There's still going to be a very sharp increase as a fraction of income going back further on. It's just that we don't observe the data on wages further back in order to be able to say what's happening as a fraction of income.
It seems like, and I think gets at that quite a bit, because it's probably hard to make assumptions about fertility also changing like this, but it seems like you could do if you have the fertility data, how many kids and what the gender composition of those kids are, that in some way you could look and see, figure out the share of income as a function of kind of the composition of my children. And if you can show or look at changes in that might be a slightly more nuanced or more direct way to test this idea. But saying, I'm dedicating a portion of my income or my wealth to my daughter as this premortem.
Yeah. No, thanks. That's a great suggestion. It's not something we thought about doing before. I should say also I'm recording comments because I know I'm not going to be able to write them down fast enough. So thanks. That's really helpful. So if you don't see me writing it down, it's not because I don't value your feedback. It's because I'm going to write it down. Okay, so let's actually jump into some of these theories. And so the first theory we're going to be looking at is the Sanskritization hypothesis. And so this is one we're going to be able to look at pretty quickly. And so the idea of this is dowry is something that's always been practiced among upper caste groups. And what's really happening is lower castes are beginning to emulate upper castes to increase their perceived status in the caste hierarchy. And so this might be happening along other behaviors that we indeed do see some adoption of over time, such as vegetarianism, wearing of the sacred cord, these sort of practices. If that were the case, then when we do what we are going to do in a second in our data, which is plot what are the proportion of marriages by caste in which we observe dowry being paid, we should see something that looks like this. Where for Brahmins, the highest caste, the priestly caste, we should see that there are a very high proportion of marriages in which dowry are being paid. And it's really other caste groups that are catching up. And you can lump up other general castes there if you wanted to, but really it should be a catch-up pattern, where there's some group that has much higher rates and other groups are catching up. In fact, what we see is not that at all. And so it does look historically, Brahmins, which are the blue, maybe have slightly higher rates of dowry payment than the other groups. But this really seems to be something which all of the groups are increasing, at roughly the same time periods. Maybe Brahmins are a little bit faster than the other groups, and there may be some reasons we think that would happen, but that doesn't really seem to be explaining what's going on. And so we don't think this is an invalidation of the Sanskritization hypothesis as a whole. For other practices, maybe this is true. But for dowry, this doesn't seem to be able to explain this rapid adoption of dowry that we're observing. And so, this is a theory that's been cited, hundreds of times in the literature. This doesn't seem to be able to explain what we're seeing. Yeah.
Just curious, how good is the reporting of caste in the survey?
Yeah.
Is there?
So it's very good. So so the nice thing in the red data is they don't just report like broad caste grouping. They report like specific subcasts, and so we can do validations to check Gaurav knows Maharashtra really well because that's where he's from, and so we can check to see whether it matches, and it seems to be matching really well. Okay, and so so that theory doesn't seem to be able to hold water. It doesn't seem to be able to explain what we see. The second theory we're going to look at is the marriage squeeze hypothesis. And so Shoshana has written on this before, but looking at other aspects of how marriage squeeze may affect economic activities. And so the idea of this is that if women are marrying at younger ages than men, so in our data set, I think women are marrying at ages 15, 16, men are marrying at ages 22, 23, 24. If there's population growth happening over time, there's just going to be more 15 and 16-year-olds than there are 22 and 23-year-olds. And so as a function of this population growth, if the population is growing, which it is over this time period, then we should see that there's going to be more women than men on the marriage market. And because of this squeeze, this competition over these scarce grooms, maybe this is going to cause dowry payments to go up. And so the prediction of this is that if there's an excess of women due to a growing population, this will lead to increases in dowry prevalence and size. And of course, there's many other reasons why we might have imbalanced sex ratios, as we see in modern India. Here we're mostly going to be focused on population growth because that's really what's happening in this time period. And in fact, if you plot population growth around, sort of over time population growth around when dowry rise is happening, the two time series seem to match up extremely well. The question is this actually the case? Is this actually what's causing dowry to go up? And so the evidence on this so far, so there's a nice paper in 1993 by Rao. He'll be using the ICRASAT data. So this is the data with about 200 marriages over a 60-year time period from 3 districts, looking to see, is it the case that districts where the sex ratios are getting more imbalanced, are those the places that dowry is going up? And so in the initial paper, he finds that it is. This data was then reanalyzed in a 2000 paper commenting on it, where she did not find any evidence of a relationship between sex ratios and dowry. It's then reanalyzed by Rao again, saying, I can't replicate my original results, but if I add in a quadratic term, then we do see a relationship. But what he says at the end of the paper, I think quite recently, is that we just don't have enough data to say this convincing. And so what we're going to try to do is do something very similar with a larger sample size, and looking across all of India rather than from just 6 villages, 3 districts. And so this is something that's also been contested on theoretical grounds. So I'm not going to go into the mechanics of the theory, but Sion Anderson has a really nice theory saying on theoretical grounds, what we should expect is that as there's imbalanced sex ratios, rather than seeing changes in dowry, what we really should see is changes in the ages at which people get married. Where if there's an excess number of 15 and 16-year-old women, maybe they wait a little bit longer to get married, or maybe men get married at slightly younger ages. And she has a nice model showing why she thinks this should take place. And so what we're going to be testing here is first looking at dowry, and then looking at marriage age to see does this match up with the Anderson theory. And so the way we're going to be defining the marriage age sex ratio is you're going to be taking the women who are aged 10 to 25 over a 5-year period divided by the men aged 20 to 35. The reason we're doing it in 5-year age bins is because that's how the census reports ages. And so we're going to be looking at this at the district level. So again, this is a 30 mile by 30 mile unit. I think there's about 500 districts in India. There's more now. It's like 650 now. But think about 500 or so districts dividing up the state. What we're going to be doing is a reduced form regression. So we're going to be regressing some measure of dowry payment. So we're going to be looking both at the extensive margin of dowry payment, whether or not dowry is paid, and then the size of the dowry payment that is made. We're going to be regressing this really on sex ratio is the main thing. We're going to have district level fixed effects and time level fixed effects. And so where you think about identification coming from is areas in which there's faster increases in marriage market sex ratios as opposed to places where they're slower. Do we see that dowry is increasing in those places where there's bigger increases in sex ratios? And so I should say for the marriage market sex ratio, because we were talking about this a little bit earlier, there's actually in the paper 3 ways in which we're going to do this. So the main results in the main paper is using the census data. And so this is coming from the 61, 71, 81 censuses. And so this is looking in 1971, what is the proportion of people in this age group? And then also, pushing that forward to 76 through 81 to see what's the percentage of people in these age groups. Other ways that we've done this in the paper as a robustness check is use a different data set, so the National Sample Survey, where they're going to be defining sex ratios not at the district level, but at the state caste level. So what is the sex ratio for a particular broad caste grouping within a particular state? Because we know that marriage markets are within caste groups, and so we might be worried that what we'd really like to see is district caste level sex ratios. No data could possibly let you do that. You need just an incredibly large amount of data. It's just not possible to do. So we check the robustness to using state caste as well. And also another way of defining the age bins, where we're going to be using census data allows us to identify at the yearly level how many 1-year-olds there are, 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds there are. There's going to be some weaknesses with that data, so that's why that's not our main specification. We find very similar results when we do that as well. And so to stop the mystery, what we want to look at now is to see, do sex ratios actually affect the dowry payments that are made? We find is they do not seem to. And so in the first column, we're looking at the extensive margin of dowry payment, so whether dowry is paid or not. We don't see any effect on the extensive margin. If anything, it goes the opposite direction of what we think. Again, for dowry value, we don't see a statistically significant relationship between the sex ratio and the dowry payments that are made. And this is robust to using other definitions of sex ratio. Something you might be worried, yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Complete that thought. And then...
Okay, so something you might be worried about, which probably is not what you're worried about, but maybe someone in the audience is worried about, is that what this could be confounding is really what this is about is changes in sex selective behavior over time. So this isn't so much about population growth, this is really more about sex selection. Where it may be places where sex selection is going up, and so this is affecting the sex ratio. This is maybe having some effect on our findings. So we can include and control for contemporaneous sex ratio. This is the ratio of men and women who are aged 15 to 20, so people who are aged in the same age range. And so here our variation, when we include that control, our variation is really coming from lagged population growth. So you should think of where the variation coming from is population growth that happened 15 or 20 years before. And that's really where the identifying variation is coming from. And so when we include that, we don't really see any effect, any difference in our results.
What about possible migration with certain areas that are close to the big cities?
Yeah.
We would have more migration, and if you're measuring the sex ratio, especially for women starting with age 10, and what about if a lot of them leave the village to go to the city?
Yeah. So there's a robustness check that we've done for that, which may or may not be in the paper. And so what we do then is we use the census data on people who are below the age of 10, where there's just very, very little migration in India below the age of 10. You should really be thinking about this as it's mostly men who are moving to the cities for labor reasons or temporary migrations or whatnot. And so if we instead define these sex ratios rather than defining it in 1971, 10 to 25, we take people in the 61 census who are 0 to 10 and use that for defining the sex ratios instead, we get very similar findings. And so we don't think it can be due to migration and the fact that we see this.
So my concern, and I don't know, this may not be relevant, but we're very used to always including our time fixed effects at all times, right? But it seems like the identification that you're kind of, the variation you're identifying here is within a given year, the sex ratios that are above versus below, kind of the district average and all that. But if you're having these things that are kind of moving together over time, and the big change is really coming from year to year variation, are you worried that these year fixed effects are actually wiping out the most important variation that could be driving this?
No, that's a fair point. So we are certainly eliminating some of the variation that we see here.
Mm-hmm.
So let me show you the next results and then come back to that, because I think what the next results suggest is that it's not just that we're wiping out variation in sex ratios, it's really that there doesn't seem to be much going on here. So let me come back to that one sec, because that's a great point. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to look at, so this is in terms of whether dowry is paid. The next thing we're going to be looking at is age of marriage. And so here we're going to be looking at is exactly as predicted by the Anderson theory, so this is the 2007 JET paper. She says what we should really see the adjustment is in the age of marriage. And so we see is exactly that. And so we define the age gap. So in the REDS data, we only observe age of marriage for the household head. And so we have a much smaller sample of marriages, only about 5,000. We see that the age gap between men and women when they get married is decreasing as the marriage squeeze gets more and more important. Where we see this adjustment happening is really in the age of marriage for women, and so women are getting married at older ages. Potentially this is one mechanism for why we see the age of marriage for women has been going up over time in India, though it's not the focus of our paper. I should be very clear, we are not the first people to show that marriage squeeze leads to changes in the age of marriage. It's been shown across a variety of different contexts. However, as far as we know, this is the first time it's been shown in a society which is currently paying dowry. And so given that there's also this potential adjustment margin of dowry, we think it's important to look at this as well. And so I should say also there's a lot of other, so Shauna has done work looking at marriage squeeze on other aspects of economic decision making, not the focus of our paper today. Today we're just talking about dowry. And so it seems like what's happening here is dowry really can't explain, or the marriage squeeze really can't explain what we're seeing in dowry. And so getting to your point here, so you're absolutely right, we're certainly eliminating a lot of the variation. So you might worry there's like a baby in bathwater thing, like in the minimum wage literature that I don't want to wade into given how contentious that is. What we think is that given that we are seeing these strong effects on age, especially given that after we've even reduced our sample size by a factor of 7, we don't think it's just that we're throwing out all the variation in sex ratio, given we're still able to see relatively strong results with this. And so you're totally right, we're identified on one particular component of the sex ratio, but given how endogenous the other parts of the sex ratio are, potentially we kind of think that, given, so I think you're right in the sense that maybe we should run this without time fixed effects and see what it looks like, or maybe just including a linear time trend or something like that would be a nice way to do that. So thanks, I think a linear time trend would be a nice way to do that. So thanks, yeah. And even state linear time trends, I think is nice.
So over this time period, women's age of marriage increased by 4.5?
No, so it didn't increase by
What
4.
does that number mean?
Yeah. So this is so the sex. So you have to multiply this by the sex ratio, and so the changes that we see in the sex ratio here, it's never by more than a factor of 0.3, and so you can multiply this by 0.3. That's like the maximum change that we observed from 1940 to 1970, and so you can multiply it by that. So it's definitely not explaining a 3-year gap. It's a much smaller gap.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so the next theory that we're going to want to test is on groom quality. And so the idea of this goes, all the way back to Becker in 1973 and work after. The idea of this is that people are getting married, they're matching in a two-sided matching model, where people's utility from a particular marriage is a function of bride and groom characteristics. The way we can think about this is, everyone's coming into a room, if you want to think of it in the crudest way possible, brides and grooms, there's a set of brides and grooms, they're matching on characteristics. And the way that they're matching is they're creating a set of matches that are stable, such that no bride or no groom would prefer to deviate, or no one bride and one groom would prefer to deviate from their match and marry someone else. And so, there's plenty of theory on this. That's not going to be the focus of our paper, and we're in fact going to be building on an Anderson paper that basically does the theory for us. And so the idea here is dowries are going to be groom prices that clear the marriage market, where these matches are going to be stable if no bride prefers to offer a dowry to another groom, such that she can match with that groom and she'd prefer to make that match and the groom would also prefer to make that match. What's going to happen here in equilibrium is that higher quality grooms are going to get larger dowry payments. And so this is going to speak a little bit to the bequest discussion that we had earlier, because, so I'll come to that in a second. But the idea here is that if there's higher quality grooms, if I'm a bride, I prefer to marry a higher quality groom. This is going to increase my utility from the marriage. And so in order to match with this higher quality groom, I'm going to have to offer him a larger dowry in order to match with him. And so here men and women are going to be differentiated along a single dimension of quality. So this is the picture version of the idea of this to try to say, what do we think is going on in this case? With some assumptions, what we should see is positive assortative matching, where we're going to see is assume that brides and grooms are characterized by one single dimension of quality, which we would think of as household wealth or something like that. Obviously this is crude, there's a lot of other dimensions on what people are matching, but this is, I think, the approximation we need for the paper here. The idea here is if brides are characterized by the wealth level of their household, so you think the wealth level of their parents, grooms are characterized by the wealth level in terms of potentially their household, potentially also their earnings opportunities. We're going to see positive assortative matching, where the way that dowries are going to be determined is going to be based on the matches. Where for this particular match, so this is the lowest quality groom, the lowest quality bride, the dowry in this match is going to be determined what is the excess utility that the bride gets for marrying this groom versus remaining single. Because she's not going to be willing to give any more than that. If she preferred to remain single given a certain dowry payment, she's not going to pay any more than that. And so this is going to pin down the payment that's made at the time of marriage. When we think about what's the dowry payment that's made in this marriage in order to make this a stable set of matches, it's going to be a dowry payment such that this bride would prefer not to offer this dowry to get this higher quality groom, and so it's really going to be pinned down by the differences in quality between these grooms, as well as something about the brides over here. And so a way that you can think about what's going on here is the size of dowry that is paid for each of these particular marriages is really pinned down by two things. One is the value of remaining single for women, and the second is the relative quality differences between grooms. And so what we're going to be trying to explain here is why do we see changes in dowry payments that are occurring over time? What our theory is going to be, and not our theory, so this is something, so Srinivas hypothesized this way back in 1983. Siwan Anderson had a really nice paper in 2003 talking about this potentially in Pakistan, but with no data, and then a huge aid paper in 2015 with a grad student co-author that has basically the same model, but with some nice other complications thrown in here. And the idea of what's happening here is that what's happening during the process of modernization is, prior to modernization, think of the Indian economy in 1930s, 1935. Most people are in the rural sector. Wealth is primarily going to be determined by allocations of land. This is something, there's certainly some shift in this over time, but not so many shifts. What we're starting to see happening during the process of modernization is that there's a bigger dispersion in the distribution of groom quality. And so what's happening now is that due to, for example, government jobs opening to Indians in a way that they weren't before, due to other factors in the modernization process, or salaried jobs, more people moving to cities where these might be available, we see is there start to be shifts in the distribution of groom quality. And so the simplest way you could think about this is, let's say that before the highest quality groom was, the person who owned land in the village. And so the person who owns the most land in the village. Now what's happening is some of these grooms are starting to take on government jobs, starting to take on other salary jobs. That makes them very attractive as a potential marriage partner because these are more stable people to match with. So in like a Rosenzweig and Stark framework, you want to match with people who potentially can help you risk share. And so what's going to happen is now that there's some of these grooms who are starting to get education, so we start to see compulsory primary education starting to come in some Indian states around the 1920s and 1930s. As we start to see some of these high quality grooms starting to emerge, who potentially are going to command a higher dowry payment because you're willing to pay more in order to match with them. As there's this increased dispersion, at the same time there's still this lower tail of the distribution who's not getting educated. These are the rural landless laborers. Were there in the 1930s, they're there today. What's going to happen is these grooms are going to start to get larger dowry payments. And this is going to start to lead to a dowry inflation. In a way exactly what we saw earlier when we were looking at the distribution, where there's going to be a shift outwards in the upper tail of the distribution because there's now starting to be these higher quality men who are earning these higher dowry payments. This essentially being the dowry payment distribution to shift out in a way very similar to what we saw before, where the shift is going to be concentrated more in this upper tail of the distribution. Potentially not fully in the upper tail of the distribution, because those are people who maybe just have a ton of land, and so modernization really doesn't matter that much for them. But it's really the people who are potentially starting to be affected by the growth of education, the growth of other types of jobs. And so as there's an increase in dispersion, so we start to see grooms shifting outwards, this is potentially going to lead to overall inflation in dowry payments. And so do we go to 45 past?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm gonna skip the first pass and just talk about the second pass. And so what we're going to try to test is, does this seem to be what's going on? And so the main thing that we want to determine here in testing whether or not this can explain what we see is, when we went into this paper, we wanted to find some great instrument for groom quality that's going to be affecting it some places than others. We did not find that instrument. What we found is something that we think is also pretty compelling. And so what we're going to be doing here is trying to understand, how does groom quality determine the size of dowry payments that are made? And so in a model in which what this is really about is groom price, where you're paying is to get a higher quality groom, we'd expect higher quality grooms to earn more. If this is simply about request, this is essentially not going to be what's happening. The issue though, and so people have looked at this before, so they've looked at cross-sectional data to see, are grooms that are higher education, do they also tend to get more dowry? And the answer is yes. But it's hard to know what's driving this. Is it because those are just wealthier households who are paying more money generally? Because you're looking at this across the cross-section, many different households. Is it maybe something about unobserved tastes for dowry? Or maybe communities with more educated grooms have higher taste for dowry? Sort of the preferred referee explanation for something you couldn't possibly test, and hard to understand why that might be true. Maybe it's true. And so what we're going to be using in our data set is taking advantage of the richness of our data to get rid of both of those confounds that we might be worried about. Where what we might be worried about is that there's household level differences in wealth that might affect the dowry payments that are made, or there's household level differences in preferences that might affect the dowry payments that are being made. What we're going to do is not only put in household fixed effects, which might account for some of that, but put in household 5-year fixed effects. What in effect this is going to be doing is we're going to be running the following regression. We're going to be looking at dowry as a function of groom education, time fixed effects, so just looking at trends over time that are happening on the aggregate, and also a household 5-year fixed effect. What this implicitly is going to be doing is saying, let's take a household that had 2 brothers that were married within the same 5-year period. One of these brothers has more education than the other. Is it the case that the brother who has more education also gets a higher dowry payment? Because if it's the case, this can't be about household level taste, because the people who are making the decisions, the parents, exactly the same household. By restricting a household 5-year fixed effects, there can't be shocks to taste or shocks to wealth that are differentially affecting one versus the other. We're also going to include birth order fixed effects, which should be in this regression, which aren't going to be in it. And so we're going to look to see, is this the case? Is it the case that there are indeed returns where grooms who have more education are indeed more likely to get dowry and likely to get larger amounts of dowry? And that is going to be, in fact, exactly what we see. And so here we're running this regression, so we're using the data set in cases where we observe multiple marriages within the same household in a 5-year period. We see grooms that have more education are much more likely to get dowry and get larger dowries. And so just to give you a sense of the magnitude of these estimates. And so this means for every additional year of groom education, we see they get about 1,000 more rupees in dowry payments. And so given that the median dowry we see in our sample, depending on the time period, is going to be around 15,000 or 20,000, as you go from 0 education to 12 education, this is explaining a lot of the variation that we observe in the size of the dowry payments that are made. And so, yeah.
So what's the average education?
So the average education, so it depends on which era you look at. So if you go back into the 1950s, it's 2 years of education. As you go into the modern era, it gets higher. I forget exactly what but it'll be somewhere around 6 to 8, somewhere around there. Yeah. Okay. So, and so that's exactly where we're going to get to it in 1 second. And so what it looks like here is that there really does seem to be the case that differences in education levels are explaining some of the differences we see here. Of course, maybe this isn't just about education. Maybe this is about all the other measures of quality that are correlated with education. We don't actually care about that for our paper. All we really care about is that quality differences, even within the household, are predictive of the changes in dowry, of differences in dowry that we see. And so if we do indeed observe these changes in the quality distribution over time, this potentially can explain the changes that we observe. And so this is getting to Ryan's question, to look to see, as education increases, how much potentially of this that we see here can this explain in terms of dowry. Before doing that, however, we're going to want to rule out one possible explanation. And does this explain the dowry is going to occur? So given we see that there's real returns to dowry, does this actually imply dowry inflation? And so it turns out it depends. And what it depends on what people's preferences are over. Is it about relative quality, or is it about absolute quality? Where if what I really care about, it's a signaling model of why I'm marrying a particular groom, I really want to marry the groom who's at the 80th percentile of quality. I don't really care how much education he has. And so the groom at the 80th level, 80th percentile of quality, they're going to get some dowry regardless of whether they have 10 years of education or 8 years of education. On the other hand, if this is about absolute levels of quality, then the years of education are going to be what matters. And so something we're going to be able to do in our data is we're going to be able to take the NSS data to look to see groom in a particular marriage market within a particular state and caste group. And so this is actually going to get to some of the concerns about migration. So most of the migrations, if they're moving to the cities, it's oftentimes within the same state, if it's not temporary migration. So you could use that marriage market sex ratio as well if that's something you're concerned about, and you get the same effect. I shouldn't have jumped back in the slide. I'll tell you that. I'll talk more about that after. And so what we're going to do is run a horse race here, because we can see the groom, what percentile are they in the quality distribution of grooms of the same caste and the same state in the year in which where they're getting married. And we can run a horse race to see, is what's driving the differences in dowry, is this about relative quality or groom quality? What we're going to be doing, where what's happening is, let's say it's all about relative groom quality. What's going to be happening here is there's not going to be any dowry inflation, even if educational levels are increasing. Because you don't care about marrying a guy who has 12 years of education, you care about marrying a guy who's at 80th percentile. If it's absolute, we should see these effects. As I said, we're going to pool the rounds of the NSS data, get the rank of each of the grooms, and then run a regression very similar to the one that we ran before. So here what we're going to be doing is, again, we're going to be including these household 5-year fixed effects, and running a regression that looks like this, where we're going to be running a regression of dowry on absolute level of education, relative level of education, so relative ranking within the quality distribution, and including household 5-year fixed effects and time fixed effects. So in terms of thinking about where is the identification coming from here, it's coming, so think there's two sets of brothers. So let's say one set of brothers is OBCs in Rajasthan, another set of brothers are general caste in Rajasthan. Both of these sets of brothers one brother has 8 years of education, the other has 10 years of education. In the OBC educational distribution, the difference in relative ranking of education is 10 percentage points, because the one with 8 years of education is at the 40th percentile, the one with 10 years is at the 50th percentile. For the general caste distribution, the difference in relative levels is at 20 percentage points. And so because of the segmentation of marriage markets, we're going to have identification both on the absolute and the relative level to look to see which of these are explaining the differences we see. When we do this, so the first column what we're going to run is we're going to be looking just at relative levels of education. And we observe, now this is more of a sanity check just to see, is our measure of relative ranking within the caste distribution, is this actually meaningful, is this good? It seems like, yeah, this is pretty predictive of the dowry people get. The next thing that we're going to look at is to say, let's run a horse race looking both at the extensive margin and the intensive margin. Of course, the problem that we're going to have here is that relative ranking and absolute ranking are incredibly highly correlated with each other. And so our standard errors are going to go up by about a factor of 3 when we do this. And so when we look at the extensive margin, maybe there's some evidence that's a little bit stronger for absolute relative, where this shrinks by about a factor of 3 relative to this coefficient here. This actually shrinks by a much smaller fraction, but the standard errors go up by a factor a lot, and so we're not going to be able to say anything. What we can't say is in terms of the dowry value, it really does seem like the absolute level of education what's driving what we see. And so this suggests that really this is what's going on, and so this can explain what we're seeing here. And that as we see inflation in the absolute level of groom quality, this will lead to inflation in dowry. Now we want to get it back of the envelope to try to understand, how much could this explain of the changes that we actually observe, so getting directly to your point, which is that how much has the educational distribution changed over time? We're going to say, let's take the changes in the educational distribution, multiply those by the returns to education that we see and using these 5-year fixed effects, and see when we put all those things, we sum all this together, how much can this explain the changes that we see in dowry? When we see this, we see that this can explain more than 2/3 of the changes that we see in the levels of dowry that are observed over time, and so I think this can explain most of what we're seeing. I'll quickly, in 1 minute, just summarize the second part of this. So what this says is if we look, between 1930 and 1980, we look at the changes in the educational distribution, we look at the returns to education within each 5-year time period and put these together, it seems like this can explain a lot of what we're seeing in terms of the inflation that's happening. Where even if, initially what dowry was about was these are the strugan, the transfers that are made for bequest purposes, it seems like this has at least transitioned over this time period where it's really much more about group price, because what's happening here is we do see these big differences just even between brothers. So, same family, same norms. And so this seems to be explaining, what we can see. The last thing I want to quickly talk about is that what's happening in the later part of the period. So we see post-1975, there's these weird decreases in the average size of dowry driven by the upper tail of the distribution. And so there's a few explanations we have in mind. One is exactly what you said, where maybe what's happening here is these, wealthier households, they value bride education, maybe for reasons of educating children or something like that. So there's some nice work in that in India by Foster and others. So that's one explanation. Our data is not very good for testing that for reasons I'm not going to talk about right now. Something else that we think might be going on is if you imagine marriage markets as not being matching markets, but as search markets, which is probably what we think is happening. We're not really seeing, everyone is getting into a room and then they're matching assortatively. What's really happening in practice is, your daughter is of a marriageable age. You're going to send out feelers across your cast network to find out where are some appropriate grooms. In the modern era, maybe newspaper advertisements, other advertisements. What's going to happen is potential brides and grooms are going to match. They're going to bargain over dowry. If they can agree on a payment, that they're going to match. If they can't agree on a payment, then they're going to stop and they're going to rematch with someone else. And so what's going to happen here is, of course, higher quality grooms are going to command higher payments since there's higher surplus from marrying. What's going to happen over time is as the fraction of high quality grooms increases on the marriage market, if you're a bride, in the earlier period, if you match with a high quality groom, that's a groom that you want to marry. If you rematch, there's almost no shot that you're going to find a groom of such a high quality level. As time goes on and there's more of these educated grooms, there's going to be more of an opportunity to find these types of grooms if you rematch. And so maybe this is decreasing the dowry payments that are made in exactly the way that we see here. Okay, and what I see, so we run a regression, what we find is that the returns to education are going down in areas where the fraction of educated grooms is going up. This is again using the household 5-year fixed effect. So we're comparing basically sets of brothers in places where there's a lot of highly educated grooms versus those where there's not. You find that the returns to education in terms of dowry are decreasing in those places where there's more educated grooms. This can explain some of what we see, certainly not all, but we think exactly the mechanism we have in mind is explaining a lot of what we see. Having said that, there's a lot of, we can't test everything, so we've got, a lot of theories in this paper that we want to test. I think there should be a future follow-up work that tries to understand the female side of the market, since we're really focused on the male side of the market. But this is what we have today, establishing how dowry changed and trying to understand why is this changing. So thank you for your comments and questions, and particularly suggestions on future analysis, since again, we just redid a lot of analysis, and this is the perfect time to do this feedback. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Next week, Scott Carroll will be here to talk about, I think the title of his talk is My Professor Cares. He's presenting some experimental evidence on the role of faculty engagement. So I will see you on Thursday. Thank you again.